In the high-stakes world of venture capital, information isn't just power. It's the only currency that matters. For 5 years, I was the most powerful person in the room, yet no one ever looked me in the eye. I was the executive assistant to Julian Vane, the CEO of Vane Associates. Julian was a man who graced the covers of business magazines, a visionary who claimed to build empires from scratch. But Julian didn't build anything. I did. I managed his calendar, his bank accounts, his extracurricular affairs, and most importantly, his secrets. To Julian, I was a ghost, a piece of office furniture that happened to speak. He would scream at me if his espresso was 65.5 degrees Celsius instead of 68 degrees Celsius. He would humiliate me in front of board members to make himself look tough. Once, he even made me wait in a rainstorm for 3 hours outside a club just to hand him an umbrella he didn't even use. "You're lucky to be here, Elias," he would sneer, throwing a stack of files at my chest. "Without me, you're just a kid with a useless degree and a mountain of student debt. You're invisible. Remember that." I remembered. I remembered every insult, every late-night errand, and every time he docked my pay for clerical errors that never existed. But what Julian forgot was that being invisible has one massive advantage. You see everything. I saw the shell companies he used to dodge taxes. I saw the way he embezzled funds from the employee pension plan to pay for his $20 million yacht. And I saw the one thing that would eventually become his undoing, a hidden digital ledger that proved he had defrauded the federal government of nearly $150 million over the last decade. Julian thought he was untouchable because he was loud. I knew he was vulnerable because I was silent. I had been patient for 5 years, waiting for the one mistake he couldn't charm his way out of. That mistake happened on a Tuesday morning, during a closed-door meeting with his primary investors. He didn't know I had left a recording device hidden inside a hollowed-out Best CEO trophy on his desk. As I sat at my desk outside his glass office, listening to the live feed of him laughing about liquidating the suckers, I realized it was time. I wasn't going to just quit. I was going to dismantle his life, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but the ego he loved so much. To understand why I stayed in that toxic glass cage for 5 long years, you have to understand the leverage Julian had over me. I wasn't just a random hire. I was a desperate one. When I graduated with a degree in finance, I wasn't just looking for a career. I was looking for a lifeline. My mother had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder that required a treatment costing nearly $15,000 per month. Between her medical bills and my $80,000 in student loans, I was drowning. Julian knew this. He had headhunted me specifically because I was hungry. In the interview, he didn't ask about my skills. He asked about my debts. "I like people who need money, Elias," he had said, leaning back in his Italian leather chair. The smell of expensive cigars clinging to his $5,000 suit. "Hungry people don't have ethics. Hungry people don't ask questions. You do what I say, and I'll make sure your mother gets her medicine. But if you ever cross me, I'll ensure you never work in this city again. I'll make sure your credit score is a memory and your mother's treatment stops the next day." It was a deal with the devil, and I signed it in blood. For the first 2 years, I was the perfect soldier. I worked 100-hour weeks. I watched him berate waitstaff, belittle his own wife, and manipulate stock prices, all while I kept his books clean. I became an expert at the art of the smokescreen. I learned how to move money through various accounts so that a $500,000 loss on paper looked like a $2 million gain to the shareholders. Every time I felt my soul eroding, I would think of my mother's hospital room. But then, everything changed. I discovered that Julian wasn't just tough, he was a predator. I found a file on his private server labeled insurance. It wasn't about health insurance or property. It was a collection of dirt on every employee, every partner, and even the local politicians. He wasn't running a business. He was running a blackmail empire. That was the night I realized that Julian didn't actually have the power to stop my mother's treatment. He had been overcharging the company for employee health benefits and pocketing the difference. He wasn't giving me a lifeline. He was stealing the rope and charging me for the privilege of holding on to the end of it. The debt I owed him wasn't real. It was a cage of my own making, built on the lies he told me. From that moment on, I stopped being his assistant and started being his auditor. I began the long, tedious process of copying every single encrypted file, every offshore transaction, and every recorded insurance conversation. Julian thought he owned me. He didn't realize I was already calculating the interest on the revenge I was about to collect. The transition from loyal employee to silent assassin happened on the night of the Vane Associates annual gala. It was an event designed for one purpose: to feed Julian's ego. Every major player in the city was there, sipping champagne that cost more than my monthly rent, while I stood in the corner with a clipboard, making sure the ice sculptures didn't melt and the VIP seating was perfect. Julian was in rare form. He had just closed a deal with a tech startup that he knew was failing, and effectively stripping the founders of their intellectual property before their company hit the wall. He was celebrating. "Elias!" he roared across the ballroom, snapping his fingers. I walked over, my face a mask of professional neutrality. He was standing with 3 of the biggest investors in the country. He looked me up and down, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "My assistant, everyone," Julian announced, his voice booming. "The most obedient man in New York. Watch this." He deliberately tipped his glass of red wine over, letting the expensive liquid soak into my white shirt and run down my pants. The room went quiet for a split second before Julian started laughing. "He won't even flinch," Julian mocked. "Elias, apologize to these gentlemen for being in the way of my wine. Then go find a cloth and clean the floor. On your knees. I don't want the marble stained." I felt the heat rising in my neck. Every instinct I had told me to swing, to shatter his jaw in front of his peers. But I looked at the hidden camera lens on the lapel of my jacket, a tiny device I'd started wearing a week prior. I was recording. This wasn't just a humiliation. It was evidence of a hostile work environment that I could use to bypass the non-disclosure agreements he'd forced me to sign. "I'm sorry, sir," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's. I knelt down on the cold marble. As I wiped the wine, Julian leaned over and whispered so only I could hear. "That's right. Stay down there. That's exactly where you belong. Don't forget, your mother's appointment is tomorrow morning. It would be a shame if the payment didn't clear." That was it. The final thread snapped. He wasn't just a bully. He was using a dying woman as a hostage to satisfy his sadistic urges. As I stood up, my shirt stained red like a target. I didn't feel shame. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I went back to my desk that night while the party continued downstairs. I opened the digital ledger I'd been building. I didn't just have his tax records anymore. I had a live recording of him admitting to the startup founders that he had sabotaged their servers, to drop their valuation. Julian Vane thought he was the king of the world. He didn't realize I had just started the countdown to his execution. The next morning, I didn't show up at the office with a resignation letter. I showed up with a smile and a fresh espresso for Julian. He didn't even acknowledge me. He just took the cup and barked a list of tasks for the day. He assumed I was broken. He thought the wine incident at the gala had finally tamed me. In reality, I was already moving the first chess piece. I had created a ghost server, a mirrored version of Julian's private cloud that looked identical but was actually feeding data directly to an encrypted drive in my apartment. While Julian sat in meetings, I spent my lunch breaks mapping the flow of his stolen millions. It was a masterpiece of corruption. Julian wasn't just hiding money. He was running a circular fraud scheme. He would take investment capital from Firm A, move it through 3 shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and then reinvest it into his own company as organic revenue to inflate stock prices. "Elias, get in here!" Julian's voice boomed through the intercom. I entered his office. He was looking at a monitor, his face red with frustration. "The auditors from the SEC are sniffing around the Delta Fund. I need you to scrub the logs for the last quarter. Now." This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. He had just given me direct verbal authorization to access the specific files that proved his criminal intent. "I'll handle it immediately, sir," I said. I sat at my terminal and began the scrub, but I wasn't deleting files. I was adding breadcrumbs. I inserted a series of tiny, invisible digital watermarks into every fraudulent transaction. To Julian, the records looked clean, but to a forensic auditor with the right key, those watermarks would highlight every single lie in bright neon colors. I also did something Julian never expected. I contacted his wife. Vanessa Vane wasn't the trophy wife everyone thought she was. She was a woman who had been trapped in a loveless, abusive marriage for a decade, held hostage by a prenuptial agreement that Julian had used to keep her penniless if she ever left. I knew something Julian didn't. Vanessa was the one who had actually inherited the original Vane family patents. Julian had convinced her to sign over the rights when they were newlyweds. I sent her a single, anonymous email. No text, just a PDF of the document Julian had used to forge her signature on the patent transfer. By 5 p.m., I had the SEC's attention, the wife's evidence, and the CEO's blind trust. Julian was sitting in his chair, feet up on the desk, laughing on the phone about how he had dodged another bullet. He had no idea that the bullet hadn't missed. I had just caught it, reloaded it, and was currently aiming it directly at his head. The beauty of a landslide is that it starts with a single pebble. For Julian Vane, that pebble was a $25,000 invoice for consulting services that I deliberately left on the corner of his CFO's desk. The CFO, a nervous man named Marcus, who had been looking for an exit strategy for years, knew that Julian didn't use consultants. He knew that the account number on that invoice belonged to Julian's private slush fund. I watched through the glass partition as Marcus picked up the paper, his hands trembling. He looked toward Julian's office, then back at the invoice. He didn't come to Julian. He went straight to the secure line in the break room. "Everything okay, Marcus?" I asked, appearing behind him as he hung up the phone. He jumped, his face pale. "Fine, Elias. Just confirming some numbers." "Of course," I said, offering a tight, knowing smile. "Numbers never lie. People do." While Marcus was panicking, I was finishing the Vanessa project. Julian's wife had responded to my anonymous email. She didn't know who I was, but she knew the evidence was real. I sent her a second file, the GPS logs of Julian's business trips to the Maldives, cross-referenced with photos of him with a string of mistresses, photos I had taken while arranging his travel. Julian called me into his office at 4:30 p.m. The air was thick with the smell of expensive scotch. He was pouring himself a double. "The SEC is requesting a formal interview for Friday," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "They're asking about the circular fraud you mentioned during the scrub." "How did they get that term, Elias?" I never used that word. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but my face remained a mask of dull obedience. "I'm not sure, sir. Perhaps Marcus mentioned it. He's been very on edge lately." Julian smashed his glass against the wall. "That pathetic rat. If he talks, I'll bury him. Elias, I need you to move the Delta assets tonight. Empty the offshore accounts. Move it all to the Singapore vault. Now." "Sir, that would be a direct violation of the freeze order they just issued 10 minutes ago," I replied calmly. Julian froze. "What freeze order?" I pulled up the notification on his wall-sized monitor. Every single corporate and personal account belonging to Julian Vane was locked. Red text flashed across the screen. "Account restricted. Federal investigation in progress." "What did you do?" Julian whispered, turning to me, his eyes widening as he saw me sitting in his chair. Not the guest chair, but his chair. "I did my job, Julian," I said, leaning back and resting my feet on his mahogany desk. "I managed your records, I tracked your assets, and I ensured that when the SEC came knocking, you'd be standing in a room full of smoke with no exits." I pulled a small flash drive from my pocket and held it up. "This has the recording from the gala, the audio of you admitting to sabotaging the tech startup, the evidence of the forged patents, and the list of every politician you've ever paid off." Julian lunged at me, but the heavy office doors swang open. 4 agents in suits stepped in, followed by a woman in a sharp trench coat. "Vanessa, Julian Vane," the lead agent said. "You're under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering." Julian looked at his wife, then at me. "You're dead, Elias. You have nothing. You're just an assistant." "Actually," I said, standing up as the agents handcuffed him, "I'm the whistleblower, and according to federal law, I'm entitled to 10% of the recovered assets. That's about $15 million, Julian. Enough to pay for my mother's treatment for the next 100 years. The silence that followed Julian being dragged out in handcuffs was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. The office, once a temple of his ego, now felt like a hollow tomb. Vanessa stayed behind, looking at the city skyline from the window Julian used to call his throne. "I knew he was a snake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I didn't know he was a ghost maker. He tried to erase me, Elias." "He tried to erase everyone," I replied. She's handing her a folder. "This contains the original patent filings with your father's signature. The forgery is so blatant that the court will return the intellectual property to you within 30 days. You don't need his money, Vanessa. You own the foundation of this entire company." She looked at me, a mixture of shock and gratitude in her eyes. "Why did you do it? You could have just taken the money and ran." "Because," I said, looking at the red wine stain still faintly visible on the marble floor from the gala, "some debts can't be paid in cash. They have to be paid in dignity." I walked out of the building for the last time. My mother's medical trust was already being funded by the whistleblower protection escrow. For the first time in 5 years, my lungs didn't feel constricted by the weight of Julian's secrets. But I had one more stop to make. I drove to the state penitentiary's processing center. Thanks to my status as the lead witness, I was granted a 5-minute meeting with Julian before he was moved to a high-security facility. He was sitting behind the glass, his $5,000 suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit that made him look small and pathetic. "You think you won," Julian hissed, pressing his hands against the glass. "I have lawyers you can't even imagine. I'll be out in 2 years, and I will spend every second of the rest of my life finding you." I didn't say anything. I just pulled out a small, laminated card and pressed it against the glass. It was the insurance file list, the one containing the dirt on the politicians and judges he thought would save him. I didn't just give the SEC the financial records. "Julian," I whispered through the intercom. "I gave the FBI the blackmail files. Every single friend you have in this city just got a copy of what you were holding over their heads. They aren't going to help you. They're going to make sure you never see sunlight again. It's the only way they can stay safe." Julian's face went gray. The realization hit him. He wasn't just losing his money. He had lost his protection. He was a shark in a tank full of even bigger sharks, and I had just poured blood into the water. "You're invisible, remember?" I said, mimicking his own voice from years ago. "And the best thing about being invisible is that no one sees you coming until it's too late." I stood up and walked away. As I reached the exit, I took my phone out and deleted the last of the encrypted files. The job was done. Satan, the invisible assistant, was gone. I was just Elias now, a man with a clean shirt, a healthy mother, and a future that didn't belong to anyone else. The empire of Julian Vane had turned to ash, and I didn't even look back to watch the smoke. The weeks following Julian's arrest were a whirlwind of depositions, news cycles, and legal filings. The media called it the Vane collapse, but to me, it was simply the world returning to its proper axis. Every morning, I woke up without the crushing weight of a billionaire's ego pressing down on my chest. My mother's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Freed from the stress of our mounting debts and receiving the best care money could buy, honestly earned money, she began to look like herself again. We sat on the porch of a small, quiet house I'd rented in the countryside, far away from the glass and steel of Manhattan. "You look different, Elias," she said, watching the sunset. "You don't look like you're waiting for a storm anymore." "The storm already passed, Mom," I replied, squeezing her hand. "The sky is finally clear." But while my personal life was peaceful, the corporate world was still burning. Vanessa Vane had successfully liquidated the fraudulent shell companies. With the evidence I provided, she managed to reimburse the tech startup founders Julian had sabotaged. She even set up a fund for the employees whose pensions Julian had raided. She was rebuilding the company's reputation from the ground up, and she had offered me a position as a chief operating officer. I turned her down. "I've spent 5 years in rooms where people only care about numbers," I told her over the phone. I think I'd like to spend some time in the real world for a while." However, there was one final loose end I had to tie. Julian's blackmail ledger hadn't just contained secrets. It contained a list of hidden physical assets, safety deposit boxes spread across the globe that even the FBI hadn't found yet. Julian had kept them as a nuclear option for his retirement. I didn't take the money. I didn't need it. Instead, I sent the keys and the locations to a specialized firm that handled the recovery of stolen art and historical artifacts. It turned out Julian had been investing in looted antiquities for years. I received a final notification on my laptop a month later. A private message from Julian's lead defense attorney. It was a single sentence. He wants to know how you found the Singapore account. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Julian would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, wondering which of his invisible servants had finally betrayed him. He would never realize it wasn't a single person. It was the collective weight of every person he had stepped on to climb his mountain. I was just the one who pulled the loose stone at the bottom. I closed my laptop and looked out at the trees. I was no longer an assistant, a whistleblower, or a shadow. I was a man with a name, a bank account that didn't hide crimes, and a heart that didn't beat in fear. The invisible man had finally stepped into the light. And for the first time in my life, I liked what I saw. 1 year. A year ago today, I was kneeling on a marble floor in a wine-stained shirt while a billionaire laughed at my dignity. Today, I was standing in front of a modest office building in Brooklyn. The sign on the door didn't say Vane Associates. It said, the Elias Foundation, Patient Advocacy and Legal Aid. I had used the $15 million whistleblower bounty to build exactly what Julian Vane hated most. A place where the invisible people could fight back. We specialized in helping employees navigate toxic corporate environments and funding medical treatments for families trapped in the same insurance hell my mother and I had endured. The phone on my desk buzzed. It was a private number. Elias? It's Vanessa Vane, now Vanessa Sterling, having reclaimed her maiden name, sounded stronger than I'd ever heard her. The final sentencing came through this morning. Julian got 25 years. No parole. The judge cited the blackmail ledger as the deciding factor. He's officially buried. Thanks for the update, Vanessa, I said, looking at a photo of my mother on my desk. She was hiking in the Alps, smiling and healthy. How are the restitution funds? Almost fully distributed, she replied. We've repaid the startup founders and restored the pensions. The Vane name is officially dead. I'm rebranding the entire firm to focus on ethical tech. I still wish you'd come on as a consultant. I'm exactly where I need to be, I said, looking at a young woman in my waiting room who looked just as desperate as I had 5 years ago. After hanging up, I felt a strange urge. I drove back into the heart of Manhattan. I walked past the skyscraper where I had spent those 5 years in the shadows. The gold Vane logo had been scraped off the marble. The glass windows, once so intimidating, now just looked like glass. I saw a black SUV pull up to the curb. A man stepped out, a younger version of Julian, dressed in a sharp suit, snapping his fingers at a frantic assistant who was struggling to balance 3 coffee cups and a briefcase. The assistant looked terrified, staring at the ground, apologizing for a breeze that had ruffled the man's hair. I felt a cold shiver of recognition. The cycle was starting again. I waited until the powerful man walked inside, leaving the assistant on the sidewalk to catch his breath. I walked over and handed the kid a business card. He looked at me, confused and defensive. He's going to tell you you're lucky to be there, I told him, my voice quiet but firm. He's going to tell you you're invisible. He's going to make you feel like your debt is the only thing that defines you. The assistant's eyes widened. How did you? I was you, I said. Keep your eyes open. Record everything. And remember, being invisible is only a weakness if you don't know how to use it. If it ever gets too heavy, call the number on that card. The kid looked at the card. Elias Thorne, CEO. He looked back at me, and for a second, the fog of fear in his eyes cleared. He nodded, tucked the card into his pocket, and stood a little taller. I walked away, blending into the crowd of thousands of people rushing toward their own lives. Julian Vane thought he was a titan, but titans are just statues made of stone, and stone eventually crumbles. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and the foundation was built on something Julian Vane never understood: the truth. As I reached my car, I felt the weight of the last 5 years finally lift entirely. I didn't need a yacht, a $5,000 suit, or a throne made of secrets. I had my name, I had my mother's laughter, and I had the knowledge that somewhere in a cold cell, Julian Vane was finally, truly invisible. The peace I had built was never going to be absolute. You don't dismantle a multi-billion-dollar empire and send a web of corrupt politicians to prison without leaving a vacuum. For 2 years, my foundation thrived. I was helping the little guys, the assistants, and the whistleblowers, but I was also becoming a target for those who preferred their secrets to stay buried. It started with a subtle glitch in our foundation's secure server. Then, a black sedan began appearing at the end of my driveway every Tuesday at 3 a.m. I knew the patterns. I knew the smell of a surveillance op. I was sitting in my office late one Thursday when a man walked in. He didn't have an appointment, and my front desk security hadn't buzzed him up. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and he moved with the predatory grace of someone who had spent his life in the black ops of the corporate world. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a smooth, low baritone. "My name is Sterling. I represent a consortium of investors who were inconvenienced by the collapse of Julian Vane." I leaned back, keeping my hands visible but close to the silent alarm under my desk. The only people inconvenienced by Julian's fall were the ones helping him steal. "Which one are you?" Sterling didn't flinch. He sat down and placed a tablet on my desk. On the screen was a live feed of my mother's garden. She was sitting on the bench, reading a book, completely unaware of the drone hovering 100 feet above her. "We aren't here for revenge, Elias. That's a peasant's emotion," Sterling said. "We're here for the Omega key. Julian told the FBI everything except where he hid the encryption key for the European sector. We know you have it. You didn't include it in the whistleblower files." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face frozen. The Omega key. I had found it in a hollowed-out watch case in Julian's safe, but I had kept it back. Not for money, but as insurance. It was a digital dead man's switch, containing the bank details of a global money-laundering syndicate that made Julian Vane look like a pickpocket. "If I had it," I said slowly, "why would I give it to you?" "Because," Sterling replied, leaning forward, "the people I represent make Julian Vane look like a saint. They don't want to jail you. They want to hire you. They've seen how you dismantled a kingdom from the inside. They want an auditor who can find the leaks in their own organizations before someone like you gets to them." He pushed the tablet toward me. "A $50 million sign-on bonus, total immunity, and we move your mother to a private estate in Switzerland with 24/7 security. All you have to do is hand over the key and come out of retirement." I looked at the screen, at my mother, the woman I had destroyed Julian Vane to save. I realized then that the long game wasn't over. It had just moved to a larger board. Julian was a local bully. These people were the architects of the world's misery. "I have a counteroffer," I said, sliding the tablet back. "Oh?" Sterling raised an eyebrow. "I don't work for syndicates. And I don't give up my insurance," I said, my voice hardening. "But I know that the Omega accounts are currently being targeted by an Interpol task force. If you touch my mother, if you even so much as let a shadow fall on her garden again, I won't send the key to the FBI. I'll leak it to the dark web. I'll make the accounts public. I'll let every hacker on the planet compete to see who can empty your consortium's pockets first." The room went cold. Sterling stared at me, evaluating if I was bluffing. He saw the man who had knelt in wine and didn't blink. He saw the invisible man who had become a ghost slayer. "You're playing a dangerous game, Elias," he whispered. "I'm not playing a game at all," I replied. "I'm an assistant. I know exactly how to manage an inconvenience. Now get out of my office before I start the upload." Sterling stood up, smoothed his suit, and nodded once. "The consortium will be in touch, one way or another." As he left, I didn't feel fear. I felt the familiar spark of the hunt. I opened my laptop and looked at the Omega file. I had been a victim once. I had been an avenger once. Now it seemed I was going to have to become a guardian. I picked up the phone and called Vanessa. "I need those security contacts you mentioned, the ones with the former Mossad agents. It's time to upgrade the Foundation's insurance policy." The fight for Julian Vane's empire was over, but the war for the shadows was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't just an assistant. I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. Part 10. The Swiss Gambit Target Word Count. 800 words. Techniques. High-tech surveillance. The mastermind maneuver. Turning the hunters into the hunted. The visit from Sterling changed everything. I was no longer just a local success story. I was a loose thread in a global tapestry of corruption. But the consortium made one fatal mistake. They assumed I would play defense. They assumed I would hunker down and hide behind bodyguards. They forgot that an executive assistant's entire life is built on anticipation. Within 48 hours of Sterling's departure, I had moved my mother. But I didn't send her to Switzerland. I sent her to a quiet, gated community in New Zealand, under the protection of a security firm staffed by former SAS operatives. I paid them 2 years in advance using a small portion of my whistleblowing bounty. Now, I was untethered. It was time to find out exactly who was behind the Omega key. I flew to Zurich under a false identity. Elias Thorne was vacationing in the Maldives, a trail of credit card swipes and hotel check-ins I'd automated through a series of bots. In reality, I was sitting in a gray, windowless apartment overlooking the Limit River, surrounded by 3 monitors and a packet of high-end encryption hardware. The Omega key wasn't just a list of accounts. It was a backdoor. Julian had been smarter than I gave him credit for. Just he had installed a logic bomb inside the syndicate's central clearinghouse. If a specific code wasn't entered every 30 days, the system would begin leaking the personal transaction history of every member of the consortium to the global press. Julian hadn't been a partner to these people. He was their blackmailer. And now, I held the detonator. I spent 3 days tracing the origin of the drone that had filmed my mother. The signal hadn't come from a local operator. It was bounced through a satellite relay owned by a company called Aegis Global. Aegis wasn't a venture capital firm. It was a private military contractor. Sterling isn't a businessman, I whispered to the empty room. He's a mercenary. I didn't wait for them to find me. I sent a message to Sterling's tablet, the one he'd left on my desk. "I'm in Zurich, Sterling. Room 402, Hotel Bor au Lac. Bring your bosses. Let's talk about the $100 million you've been skimming from the consortium's security fund." It was a total bluff. I had no proof he was skimming. But men like Sterling, men who work for monsters, always have a side hustle. It's their only retirement plan. The trap was set. I wasn't at the Hotel Bor au Lac, of course. I was in a cafe across the street watching the entrance through a high-powered thermal lens. At 9 p.m., 3 black SUVs pulled up. 6 men in tactical gear stepped out, followed by Sterling. They moved with military precision, entering the lobby and heading straight for the elevators. While they were storming a room that contained nothing but a looped recording of my voice, I was in the back of their lead SUV. I had used a universal key fob, a gadget I'd acquired from a contact in the dark web, to gain entry. I didn't steal the car. I installed a hardware keylogger into the vehicle's onboard diagnostic port. When Sterling returned to the car, fuming because he'd been played, his phone would automatically sync with the car's Bluetooth. My keylogger would capture his passcodes, his encrypted messages, and his GPS history for the last 6 months. I watched from the cafe as Sterling slammed the SUV door and sped off. On my laptop, the data began to stream in. It was a waterfall of names, locations, and bank codes. "Got you," I murmured. The data revealed the consortium's board of directors. It wasn't just investors. It included a deputy minister of finance in Eastern Europe, a shipping magnate in Greece, and the head of a major pharmaceutical company. They were using Julian's network to move illegal medical shipments and bypass international sanctions. The Omega key was the only thing keeping them from the gallows. I opened a secure channel to Vanessa. "I have the names, Vanessa, the whole board, but I can't go to the FBI this time. The consortium has people inside the bureau." "Then what are you going to do, Elias?" Her voice crackled through the encrypted line. "I'm going to do what I did to Julian," I said, watching the moonlight hit the river. "I'm going to make them think they're winning until the moment the floor disappears. I need you to buy me a controlling stake in Aegis Global, quietly. Use the shell companies we recovered from Julian's estate." "You want to buy a private army?" Vanessa asked, stunned. "No," I replied, a cold smile crossing my face. "Han, I want to become Sterling's boss. I want to see his face when he realizes the assistant he tried to threaten now signs his paychecks." Part 11. The boardroom coped Argot word count. 850 words techniques, corporate chess, power reversal, the invisible hand revealed. The acquisition of Aegis Global was a masterpiece of shadow finance. Because Julian had buried the ownership of his shell companies under 7 layers of beneficial owners, the consortium didn't realize they were selling their own security firm to the man they were hunting. I moved nearly $40 million through a series of blind trusts in Singapore and Mauritius. By the time the markets opened on Monday, I owned 51% of Aegis. I didn't call Sterling. I didn't send an email. I waited for the monthly security briefing at the Aegis headquarters in Virginia. I walked into the building wearing a suit that didn't just fit. It commanded. I wasn't the man with the clipboard anymore. I was the man who owned the clipboard, the building, and everyone inside it. I walked straight past the front desk, my fingerprint already registered in the system as the primary shareholder. The boardroom was a fortress of glass and steel. Sitting around the table were the heavy hitters of the consortium. They were discussing the Elias thorn problem as if I were a pest to be exterminated. Sterling was at the head of the table showing a slide deck of my last known locations in Zurich. "He's ghosting us," Sterling was saying, his voice tight. "But he's arrogant. He thinks he's smarter than the collective weight of this board. I suggest we move to phase 2, intercepting his mother in New Zealand." I pushed the double doors open. The sound of the heavy wood hitting the stoppers echoed like a gunshot. "I wouldn't recommend that, Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. "The security team in New Zealand has standing orders to engage any Aegis contractor on site. And since I just updated their rules of engagement 5 minutes ago, They're currently carrying specialized armor-piercing rounds, specifically for your Phase 2 teams. The room went into a state of frozen shock. Sterling's hand went to the holster under his arm, but the two Aegis guards standing at the door, men who had been on my secret payroll for exactly 48 hours, stepped forward and shook their heads. "Sit down, Sterling," I said, walking to the head of the table. "You're in my chair." "What is this?" the Greek shipping magnate demanded, slamming his fist on the table. "Who let this clerk in here?" "I'm the majority shareholder of Aegis Global," I said, sliding a tablet across the table, "which means, as of 9 o'clock this morning, I am the lead security consultant for every one of your illegal shipping lanes, pharmaceutical labs, and offshore vaults. I have the manifests, I have the GPS coordinates, and I have the Omega key." I sat down and leaned back, mirroring Julian's old posture, but without the arrogance. I had the calm of a man who had already won. "You wanted the key?" I asked, looking at the board. "The key isn't a file, it's me. I am the only person who can keep the logic bomb from detonating. If my heart rate exceeds 120 beats per minute, or if it stops entirely, the encryption on every one of your personal bank accounts fails instantly. The data won't go to the FBI. It will go to the dark web, the IRS, and your fiercest competitors simultaneously." "You're a dead man walking," the pharmaceutical CEO hissed. "No," I replied. "I'm the only man keeping you alive. You see, Julian Vane was a blackmailer because he wanted your money. I don't want your money. I have plenty of that." "Then what do you want?" Sterling asked, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "I want a seat at the table," I said. "Not to join you, but to audit you. From this day forward, 20% of the net profits from every one of your extracurricular ventures will be diverted into a blind trust. That trust will fund the Elias Foundation's global operations. You will provide the security, you will provide the logistics, and you will do it for free." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You're going to help me save the people you've spent your lives stepping on. And if you even think about double-crossing me, I'll let the logic bomb turn your empires into digital dust before you can reach for your phones." I looked at Sterling. "And you, Sterling? You're not a mercenary anymore. You're my head of security. Your first job is to escort these gentlemen out of my building. They have a lot of donations to authorize." The board members looked at each other. They were the masters of the world, but they were trapped by a digital ghost. While they had tried to hunt a man who had already mastered the art of being invisible. The assistant didn't just have a seat at the table. He had taken the whole room. Part 12. The Global Guardian, the final chapter. Target word count. 900 words. Techniques. Full circle narrative, poetic justice, the ultimate legacy. The room cleared slowly, like a fever breaking. The masters of the universe walked out of my boardroom with their heads down, their power stripped away not by a bullet or a prison cell, but by a series of $1 bills and $0 bills. They were now the unwilling financiers of their own undoing. Sterling remained behind. He stood by the window, looking out at the Virginia woods. He wasn't reaching for his gun anymore. He was looking at me with the expression of a man who had finally met a predator he couldn't outrun. "You realize they'll never stop trying to kill you," Sterling said quietly. "Even with the logic bomb. Men like that, they can't breathe if they aren't the ones holding the leash." "Let them try," I said, tidying the papers on the desk. It was an old habit, a remnant of my days as Julian's assistant. I've spent 5 years learning how to manage difficult personalities. Now, I just have a bigger budget for the security. I walked over to the window and stood beside him. The difference between Julian and me, Sterling, is that Julian wanted to be feared. I just want to be effective. As long as the foundation is funded and my mother is safe, the consortium can keep their yachts and their mansions. But the moment they step out of line, the world finds out exactly who they are. "And what about me?" Sterling asked. "Why keep me around? You know I'd have killed you in Zurich if I'd had the chance." "Because you're the best at what you do," I replied, looking him in the eye. "And because you know exactly how the consortium thinks. I don't need a friend, Sterling. I need a bloodhound. And now that I'm the one holding your collar, I know you'll be the most loyal dog in the pack." Over the next year, the Elias Foundation became a global force. We didn't just provide legal aid, we became a shadow auditor for the world's most corrupt industries. Using the 20% tax I levied on the consortium, we built hospitals in conflict zones, funded independent journalism to expose human trafficking, and created a digital shield for whistleblowers in every major corporation on Earth. I never went back to Manhattan. I didn't need the skyscraper or the mahogany desk. I operated out of a modest house in New Zealand, near my mother. We spent our afternoons gardening, the SAS guards blending into the landscape like shadows. She never asked where the money came from, and I never told her. She just knew her son was finally at peace. One evening, a package arrived at my door. It was a small, heavy box with no return address. Inside was a single, expensive crystal glass and a bottle of $1,945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild, the same wine Julian had spilled on me at the gala. There was a note. It was from a federal prison in New York. "I heard you're the most powerful man in the world now. I hope the wine tastes like ash. Or JV." I poured a glass of the wine. It was deep, dark, and incredibly complex. I walked out to the cliffside overlooking the ocean and tipped the glass over the edge, watching the red liquid vanish into the surf. "It tastes like justice, Julian," I whispered to the wind. I walked back into my house and opened my laptop. A new notification was flashing on the screen. It was a message from an encrypted server in London. "Mr. Thorne, I'm an assistant at a major hedge fund. My boss is stealing the pension funds of 5,000 teachers. He told me I'm lucky to be here. He told me I'm invisible. I have the logs. What do I do?" I sat down, my fingers hovering over the keys. I felt a surge of the old energy, the cold, calculated precision that had brought down an empire. I wasn't an assistant anymore. I wasn't even a CEO. Oh, no, I was a guardian. I started to type. "Don't panic. Keep your eyes open. Record everything. And remember, being invisible is your greatest strength. Here is what we're going to do." The invisible man had left the shadows, but he had left the door open for everyone else to follow. Julian Vane thought he was the architect of his own destiny, but he was just a footnote in a much larger story. My name is Elias Thorne. I was once a piece of furniture in a billionaire's office. Now, I am the man who watches the watchers. And I have never been more visible in my life.